All right, let's get into it.
So the question is there purpose in nature?
And no, there are functions, but purpose is loaded with teleological claims that I don't accept.
I don't accept them, slurpy slurpy.
No, that's actually already false. You do accept purpose teleological claims because you couldn't possibly argue evolution is a thing unless there was a teleological claim towards survival. Purpose of your biology, the purpose of your eyes, the purpose of digestive. I mean, how could you possibly take a position of functionality and difference in functionality and say that there's no purpose of those things? What is...
Yeah, so something I would point out here is that it's actually a really common mistake that I see evolutionary commentators who either interact with Jim Bob or who he reviews make, which is they'll misunderstand the question that he's asking. So he'll ask a very simple question, like, for example, when we're talking about the eye, he'll say that, is it true that the organism needs an eye in order to see? And very, very frequently, we'll see this mistake of the evolutionary commentator will say, yeah, well, yeah, of course, it needs the eye in order to see. But think about what you're admitting when you say that. You're saying basically that didn't have an eye, but it has the goal of sight. And so the mutation that gives it sight, you're implicitly admitting that because there's a need there, that there's a teleology, that there's a beginning and an end goal in mind. Or not even in mind, but just that there's an end goal. No, so yeah, like Jim Bob is actually right with the language as it is. Now I understand that if you're arguing for evolution, this might not be what you meant when you answered the question that way, or that's not actually what you believe. But I mean, the language matters, and you have to understand the question that you're actually being asked. The fact of the matter is, you cannot maintain that it needs the eye or that it needs to see. It doesn't need either of those things. And this is a common mistake that I'm going to try to correct. So we're not going to watch the end of this. He just goes on to look up the dictionary definition of function. We don't need to see that. So I went ahead and I gave a little response here. This is, by the way, it's like a shameless attempt to get his attention. So this didn't quite work. So maybe if I put it in a video, that'll work. So it's apparently not little enough of a response for derp over here. Let's see. I'm autistic. I use ChatGPT. Nobody's reading. The left can't meme. All right. So the first thing we'll do is we'll go by the points. So there were two main points that I picked out from this video, and the first one is the question, which is there purpose in nature? And for Mr. Derp, don't worry, I'll read this for you, so that way you don't have to. So the first thing we do is if there is a distinction to be made between purpose and function, well, we should define these things. So I came up with function is the apparent value or effect of something, and purpose is the true value or effect. And I go on to say that science, it's about what's apparently the case, and so that's why there's, for example, scientific theories and not scientific proofs. And then I'm going to have you guys evaluate the claim that, say, for example, the function of the stomach is digestion. And what I'm going to do for this thought experiment, I'm not going to evaluate whether that's true. We're just going to assume that the function of the stomach is digestion. Seems reasonable enough, I hope. And then we're going to find out if we can resolve if that's also what its purpose is, if its purpose is identical to that function. So here's the thought experiment. We're going to assume evolution is true, obviously, because we need to, in order to establish that it has a telos, we need to assume it's like internal coherence. So we're going to suppose that evolution is true, and then we're going to ask what the telos of a universe in which evolution is true is. It could be, say, perhaps increasing entropy or something, not super important right now. Whatever that telos is, here's the question. Would the function of digestion truly be the end a stomach is ordered towards? Because remember, purpose implies an end goal. So let's evaluate. When we evaluate, we find that the stomach is a temporary species of organ. I use this language of species. I just mean it to mean like kind of organ, right? So species, it's a temporary species of organ with a diversity of structures, each with a temporary existence, many of which existing for only n = 1 generations, meaning they exist one time and then they immediately go extinct after they exist one time. They don't reproduce. Does the stomach, which fails to digest, fail its purpose? Was its purpose rather to go extinct, either immediately, and the number of generations equals 1, as in the previous case, or to go extinct a few generations later? If the variety of stomachs evolved from a common ancestor, each with unique traits not inherited by the others, did the common ancestor have a multitude of purposes to go on making several differing and or failing stomachs? Are each of those stomachs equally the end goal, or does one of them ultimately? Because what we have to consider is if we take the premise that there are a variety of stomachs and they all evolved from a common ancestor, well, okay, which one is the end goal? If we can't come up with an answer to that, then I'm not sure that we have an answer to distinct, or let me backtrack that. If we don't have an answer to that, then we don't have the identityness, the identicalness of purpose and function. So that's the first bit, is their purpose in nature. The second bit is the claim. You couldn't possibly argue evolution is a thing unless there is a teleological claim towards survival. And in my post, I granted the thing that I basically said before, that a lot of people like literally don't even understand this very basic question, and I'm agreeing. Like it's probably frustrating for Jim Bob that a lot of people just don't answer the question correctly. So then I go on to point out that the vast majority of individual organisms do not survive or reproduce. And the reason I say this is, well, actually, let me get to the next part. So the vast majority of individual organisms do not survive or reproduce. Yet they all have a phenotype based on their genotype, which means even if they don't survive and reproduce, they're still made of genes, and the genes still printed a thing, right? So it raises the question of, is there a teleological difference between a gene that prints for a thing that prints again, so it exists for more than one generation? Is there a teleological difference between that and a gene which exists only once and it doesn't reproduce afterwards? That's the question. So here's the thought experiment. If we suppose that the DNA is a printer of printers, does a printer which fails to print fail to be printed? In other words, is the purpose of the printer that printed it to make a new printer of printers? Or could it be equally argued that its purpose was simply to make a print according to the material it has, regardless of whether the number of generations are greater than 1? So again, it's the same point that I just raised. Is the point of the printer to print, or is the point of the printer to make a printer of printers? If it's just to make a print, that amounts to saying that the purpose of the printer is to print, and we're not really saying much, and we're again maintaining the distinction between function and purpose. Okay. We use the apparent function to resolve what the differences between different prints are. Survival and reproduction then become the question of, does it make a printer of printers, or does it only make prints? The stomach has the apparent function of digestion to the extent that a printer which prints a non-digesting stomach is a printer that does not print other printers. A mutated stomach of number of generations equals 1 is therefore simultaneously fulfilling its purpose, yet functionless. What is the teleological difference between a print that is represented by 0, 1, or more than one individuals? Are there grounds to claim that because a printer of printers will multiply, that is the purpose of the printer, and not the production of the unique traits that exist only once? And again, those unique traits would be prints, not prints of printers. If the purpose is the proliferation of the printer, then which of the myriad species of stomach in the world and their various functions can be resolved as the ultimate direction the stomach is ordered towards over the others? And this sort of raises the same question I raised in the last one. If there are multiple stomachs, all evolved from a common ancestor, which one was the end goal? It's not clear that one of them was. Now, you might think that this begs the question of why it needs to digest to begin with, or why it needs a stomach specifically for that function. But I think I've answered this question by the fact that a non-functional stomach, it isn't teleologically different from a functional one. No stomach is, no organ is. The common end these structures seem to share is not survival or reproduction, contrary to the original claim. Since they are, so it's not survival or reproduction because they are temporary and changing. The common end is death. We therefore cannot resolve that the purpose of a brain differs from that of a stomach to the extent that it ends in death. Either evolution does not have a telos, that telos is not the apparent function and survival of the organism, or evolved structures simply do not differ in telos, only in function. Which again, I provided the way that we can distinguish between function, because you can have a stomach which is functionless and yet it has the same purpose. The purpose is fulfilling the same end as anything else, right? Every print fulfills the same purpose of being a print, which is not the same thing as saying it has to be a printer of printers. We're not saying that. Evolution postulates that there are more printers of printers than printers of prints, because that is a multiplying system. What it's not saying is that the multiplication is the purpose of the system. And again, if you can find a way to demonstrate that it is, well, I guess that's the question I have for you. So then lastly, we do have a little response, and maybe after that explanation, you can see why I think that Jim Bob did not read it either, which is fine. You know, he doesn't. He obviously doesn't owe me attention, and apparently nobody else read it either. So it's not that big a deal. But anyway, so here's the question. How do you distinguish between function and purpose when it comes to the lower intestine? And yeah, like you can really see why I think he didn't quite read it, because you can replace the lower intestine with stomach, and I basically answered this question already. But anyway, so I did give it a response. If the purpose of the intestine is to have a goal towards an end, but it is constantly changing because of evolution, such that there are several derivations of that intestine, each with unique functions diverge from the others, which of these functions is identical to that end? And again, this is a reiteration of the same question I've been stressing, which is, if there are multiple forms of the same thing, or if there are multiple derivations of the same thing, and they all evolved from a common ancestor, which one of these derivations was the point of it? Which one was the end goal? If you don't have an answer for that, then you don't have a coherence of function with purpose. They have to be separate from each other. And then I just reiterate the definition of function and purpose, which is the difference is that functions are temporary and changing, while purposes are absolute. So yeah, Jim Bob or anybody else has an answer to this challenge, can't wait to hear it.